Hello, welcome back to my deconstruction of David Hume's Treatise of Human Nature. And we're stepping into part 3 of knowledge and probability.
File 16 of A Treatise of Human Nature by David Hume, Volume 1. This LibriVox recording is in the public domain. Recording by George Yeager, Book 1, Part 3 of Knowledge and Probability, Section 1 of Knowledge. There are 7, see Part 1, Section 5, different kinds of philosophical relation, that is, resemblance, identity, relations of time and place, proportion in quantity or number, degrees in inequality, contrariety, and causation. These relations may be divided into 2 classes, into such as depend entirely on the ideas which we compare together, and such as may be changed without any change in the ideas. It is from the idea of a triangle that we discover the relation of equality, which its 3 angles bear to 2 right ones, and this relation is invariable as long as our idea remains the same. On the contrary, the relations of contiguity and distance betwixt 2 objects may be changed merely by an alteration of their place, without any change on the objects themselves or on their ideas, and the place depends on 100 different accidents which cannot be foreseen by the mind. It is the same case with identity and causation. 2 objects, though perfectly resembling each other, and even appearing in the same place at different times, may be numerically different. And as the power by which one object produces another is never discoverable merely from their idea, it is evident cause and effect are relations of which we receive information from experience, and not from any abstract reasoning or reflection. There is no single phenomenon, even the most simple, which can be accounted for from the qualities of the objects as they appear to us, or which we could foresee without the help of our memory and experience. It appears, therefore, that of these 7 philosophical relations, there remain only 4 which, depending solely upon ideas, can be the objects of knowledge and certainty. These 4 are resemblance, contrariety, degrees in quality, and proportions in quantity or number. 3 of these relations are discoverable at first sight, and fall more properly under the province of intuition than demonstration. When any objects resemble each other, the resemblance will at first strike the eye, or rather the mind, and seldom requires a second examination. The case is the same with contrariety, and with the degrees of inequality. No one can once doubt but existence and non-existence destroy each other, and are perfectly incompatible and contrary. And though it be impossible to judge exactly of the degrees of inequality, such as color, taste, heat, cold, when the difference betwixt them is very small, yet it is easy to decide that any of them is superior or inferior to another when their difference is considerable. And this decision we always pronounce at first sight, without any inquiry or reasoning. We might proceed after the same manner in fixing the proportions of quantity or number, and might at one view observe a superiority or inferiority betwixt any numbers or figures, especially where the difference is very great and remarkable. As to equality or any exact proportion, we can only guess at it from a single consideration, except in very short numbers or very limited portions of extension, which are comprehended in an instant, and where we perceive an impossibility of falling into any considerable error. In all other cases, we must settle the proportions with some liberty or proceed in a more artificial manner. I have already observed that geometry, or the art by which we fix the proportions of figures, though it much excels both in universality and exactness the loose judgments of the senses and imagination, yet never attains a perfect precision and exactness. Its first principles are still drawn from the general appearance of the objects, and that appearance can never afford us any security when we examine the prodigious minuteness of which nature is susceptible. Our ideas seem to give a perfect assurance that no two right lines can have a common segment. But if we consider these ideas, we shall find that they always suppose a sensible inclination of the two lines, and that where the angle they form is extremely small, we have no standard of a right line so precise as to assure us of the truth of this proposition. It is the same case with most of the primary decisions of the mathematics. There remain, therefore, algebra and arithmetic as the only sciences in which we can carry on a chain of reasoning to any degree of intricacy, and yet preserve a perfect exactness and certainty. We are possessed of a...
I'm not sure why it's necessary. Maybe it's a part of the Enlightenment period that these, it's is very, very rigid is maybe even overly rigid about having to account for anything. And he's very close to mixing up ideas and abstractions. I think that's the fundamental ontology he has created is not correct. It's quite functional, but it's not correct, and it's not that these two impressionist ideas, they're too much lumped into this dichotomy in order for what follows to be understandable and avoid too much mixing up of categories. It's not the best kind of ontology, in my opinion, and very quickly lose sight of what is an idea, what is a relation, and so on, right? I find it hard to follow this. I'm not saying it's necessarily incorrect, but a philosophy has to, in my opinion, also be approachable. It is something that you can have quite a good overview at all times in your head without having to refer to some kind of manual or a treatise. You have to have it in your back pocket. Oh my God, what? Oh yeah, this is what it is. It has to be not overly complicated, but it cannot be overly simplified also, right? It's maybe the balance between complication and simplification and structure that is mandatory for it to be good philosophy. I'm having experiences, right? I'm sitting here. I can walk up and go to my kitchen. I can go to my car. I can go to the forest. I can, go to. What is it that why does it need to be so very complicated? That it gets so convoluted that I might lose overview of what I'm doing. It's important for me personally that it doesn't become more complicated than it needs to be. And if it starts to become complicated, I will be critical of my own philosophy having gone astray somewhere. Or at least the ontology I'm working from is not sufficient, or there's something missing, or there's too much in it, or it's a bad dichotomy or something, right? Adding complication is not good philosophy, in my opinion. And he is approaching something that is complicated here, in my opinion, right? Okay.
The precise standard by which we can judge of the equality and proportion of numbers, and according as they correspond or not to that standard, we determine their relations without any possibility of error. When two numbers are so combined as that the one has always a unit answering to every unit of the other, we pronounce them equal. And it is for want of such a standard of equality in extension that geometry can scarce be esteemed a perfect and infallible science. But here it may not be amiss to obviate a difficulty which may arise from my asserting that though geometry falls short of that perfect precision and certainty which are peculiar to arithmetic and algebra, yet it excels the imperfect judgments of our senses and imagination. The reason why I impute any defect to geometry is because its original and fundamental principles are derived merely from appearances, and it may perhaps be imagined that this defect must always attend it and keep it from ever reaching a greater exactness in the comparison of objects or ideas than what our eye or imagination alone is able to attain. I own that this defect so far attends it as to keep it from ever aspiring to a full certainty. But since these fundamental principles depend on the easiest and least deceitful appearances, they bestow on their consequences a degree of exactness of which these consequences are singly incapable. It is impossible for the eye to determine the angles of a kilogon to be equal to 1,996 right angles, or make any conjecture that approaches this proportion. But when it determines that right lines cannot concur, that we cannot draw more than one right line between two given points, its mistakes can never be of any consequence. And this is the nature and use of geometry, to run us up to such appearances as by reason of their simplicity cannot lead us into any considerable error. I shall here take occasion to propose a second observation concerning our demonstrative reasonings, which is suggested by the same subject of the mathematics. It is usual with mathematicians to pretend that those ideas which are their objects are of so refined and spiritual a nature that they fall not under the conception of the fancy, but must be comprehended by a pure and intellectual view, of which the superior faculties of the soul are alone capable. The same notion runs through most parts of philosophy, and is principally made use of to explain our abstract ideas, and to shew how we can form an idea of a triangle, for instance, which shall neither be an isosceles nor scale numb, nor be confined to any particular length and proportion of sides. It is easy to see why philosophers are so fond of this notion of some spiritual and refined perceptions, since by that means they cover many of their absurdities, and may refuse to submit to the decisions of clear ideas by appealing to such as are obscure and uncertain. But to destroy this artifice, we need but reflect on that principle so oft insisted on, that all our ideas are copied from our impressions. For from thence we may immediately conclude that since all impressions are clear and precise, the ideas which are copied from them must be of the same nature, and can never, but from our fault, contain anything so dark and intricate. An idea is by its very nature weaker and fainter than an impression, but being in every other respect the same, cannot imply any very great mystery. If its weakness render it obscure, it is our business to remedy that defect as much as possible by keeping the idea steady and precise. Until we have done so, it is in vain to pretend to reasoning and philosophy.
This is a chapter or a section about knowledge. I guess there might be some discrepancy by what Hume considers knowledge and what I consider knowledge. Or at least there's some, it's blurred to me, but he basically appeals to, I have to stick to my axioms or to my philosophy. I have to stick to my dichotomy of impressions and ideas. I have set up this, I have argued for it. It can only be based on that. That's sort of what I'm hearing. It's quite convoluted and polemic, and he name drops various, like isosceles norscalinum, right? About triangles. I don't know what these supposedly Latin terms are about, right? So he's sort of name dropping a bit here, right? He wants to sound like he knows what he's talking about. I guess fine with that, right? But this is quite polemic and unnecessarily polemic, in my opinion. I would make this. I still feel he's sort of gearing up a bit. He's gearing up and presenting various shit that he's then going to bring together in a big recipe later or something like that. I think he's pushing the big decision ahead of him rather than saying, okay, this follows from this, then this follows from this, then this follows from this. That's how he started out, in my opinion. Now it has become, okay, now I have to bring in science, now I have to bring in space and time, now I have to bring in geometry. It has become encumbered, this kind of thinking, right? And I think the biggest problem might be his attempt of bringing philosophy and natural sciences, or Newtonian physics or whatever, and that scientific approach together. It's not functional. It's a misconstrued idea of how to approach things. I think it's a product of the times. The new thing was science in the early 1700s, right? Still, in many ways, not in the same way as we understand it now, but it was like, well, if philosophy and it's sort of this, I think the Enlightenment philosophers and thinkers, they were rather, we have to encompass everything. There cannot be, okay, then there's the scientists over there, and then the philosophers over there, and we have our separate rooms. It has to be brought together, right? That's this all-encompassing thing. And one thing that then becomes obsolete is kind of religion, right? Because it's just crazy talk, right? And it's the appeal to the combination of science and philosophy in this sort of, I don't know, it's an unnecessary marriage because one is dependent on the other, in my opinion. Science is an offspring. It's the final step in a kind of philosophy that deals with describing the objects of your experience and how they behave, right? In a predictive manner. Science is just saying, well, when you have an elephant and throw it from the Eiffel Tower, don't do that at home, right? If you have a brick and you throw it from the Eiffel Tower, it will fall this way and it will take such long time. If you have this kind of clock, then it will hit the ground and so on. It tries to predict what happens to objects. It's just a kind of the end point, or at least so far, the end point so far, right? It might be improved or changed in the future, but who knows? But it's a particular kind of philosophy. His ontology will never get him to the point where he apparently supposedly, maybe, right? Where he will find out that it's not about combining science and philosophy. Science is just a particular kind of offspring or endpoint of a particular kind of philosophy, right? So I'm not particularly fond of this mix of science and philosophy, and I think it complicates things to such an extent that he will probably lose his sight of what he's doing, right? I don't know how to otherwise put it, but it's something like, in order for me to use this keyboard, I have to understand the whole diagram in a scientific manner of what goes on the motherboard, right? No, I don't, right? I don't need the science of the computer in order to use it, so to say, right? Don't need something that's basically, also maybe it's a bad analogy I used before with the motherboard, right? But if whatever I write on my computer here, I need to understand the science of how to understand the Word document I just wrote in order to understand how to use the keyboard, something like that, right? The ontology has to be freaking strict, right? It has to be, I'm starting with this. Okay, because I'm starting with this, I can reach this conclusion. But it's only based on that which came before, right? Then from that I can reach this next step, but it's only based on that which came before, and that's which came before that, right? In a straight line back. And science is somebody who has been coming up with all sorts of shit that is way down the line of anybody's ontology. Then you can't bring that back into your philosophy and start to mix it up with your foundational shit over here, which is the foundation of how to get to that science, right? So he is using circular argumentation here, right? And this is sort of the first time I did have a notion that we would get to this point where I will have to say, I think it's a death knell to his philosophy. Not that it's necessarily incorrect, but it has been inflated with all sorts of things that shouldn't be there. So you will very quickly lose track of what is actually important. And those things that are actually important might have been confused by all sorts of science and so on, so that you cannot really use it for anything. And he might not actually get to any decent conclusions of what to do with the conclusions, if you always have to bring that science in, right? So science has become a chain around your legs rather than being something you can do when you want to understand what happens to the brick when I throw it from the Eiffel Tower, right? Let me see, how far did we get? Yes, so the next one is of probability and the idea of cause and effect. And this is also a famous chapter, I think. I don't particularly like these aspects he's dealing with here. I'm like the aspects, the topics, but how he deals with it is sort of, okay, I'm going to give you a hint here, but I will get back to it in the next chapter down the road. And now I'm introducing probability, and of course it's sort of, it seems fractioned, in fractions. It's sort of, okay, now it's I know I have to grapple with this concept. I was just trying to understand knowledge. Now we're going into probability and cause. It's sort of, one thing doesn't lead to the other in the same fashion as in the early parts, which I like quite a good deal, right? I'm getting more and more annoyed by the way he writes it now, right? So I think we will keep this one section now. Let's see, how long is it? Let me see. I don't think we will take this one. It seems like a long one. So I will just put a blue mark here to mark that this is how far we got. And I will say, please share, like, and subscribe. Consider a donation, links below and on the board. And give me a comment. What do you think so far? Is it functional for you, this? I mean, it's just like an audiobook with annotations, right? You could say, sometimes I seem to be zoning out from his text a bit when it gets too polemic and too sort of, I feel that I can't connect this really too much with the core idea of what that section is supposed to deal with. And I have a sense of this youthful need to impress. I do get that sense, right? And maybe if I, at some point in the future, may be deconstructing his inquiries, those inquiries might be a little more mature in the way of thinking. And I also think that he criticized himself that his treatise might not have been, it might have been a little, youthful pretense, right? Trying to grasp everything in one philosophy and a treatise. It's very ambitious, no doubt about it, right? But on the other hand, those who are the untrained eye sees things that the trained eye don't see, right? That's why academic philosophy usually gets nowhere, right? They stay within the limitation of what they have been told, right? So they have been told basically to not go where other philosophers haven't gone, right? So they're staying in juggling the same kind of philosophy around, right? The untrained eye is going to possibly find something that nobody else has seen, right? It's usually the artist that hasn't been trained on, in academia, who is the good artist. Like, the Beatles weren't trained in any kind of conservatory, right? Picasso made his own art, right? He created modern art. I guess he was trained, but nobody trained him to do what he did, right? So it's those who's not limited by what they have been told by others that is good philosophy. So yes, it might be pretentious, but there might actually be some goodies here and there that is very well worth the effort digging into this, right? So there might be some pretense. Okay, fair enough. I'll deal with it when I get to it, right? And I'm sort of pointing to it here. But you might also get these very important new nuggets of philosophy that nobody has been thinking of before, because they were trained not to think, right? Or they were trained to think in a certain academic manner, where you have to have the library of 80 different philosophers who are all shouting in your ear and telling you different things, right? And this guy was sort of, okay, I can use this, I can use that, I can put together a treatise. Yeah, it might be pretentious, but there might be these important little nuggets here and there. And that might be the biggest takeaway from Hume's treatise is, when he reached those nuggets, we are possibly still dealing with these nuggets because they have been eluding people for so many years, because they are pretenses of obvious understandings that are not obvious, right? Like the idea of causation or the is-ought problem, right? Problems of inference and so on, right? So these kinds of skepticism is the takeaway of the treatise, right? This might not be the best ontology in the world, and I would personally agree with you if you said that. Personally, I find my own to be better and more useful and more functional and easier to approach. But that's just, my opinion. There might be somebody out there say, I would rather have Hume's, and so be it, right? I mean, there are no one single philosophy that everybody has to adhere to and say, yeah, this is how it is, you adhere to this philosophy. That has basically been the problem of human beings ever since, dawn of time, right? Somebody says this is how it is, obey or you can be shot, right? Maybe it's time to accept that there can be as many philosophies as there are individuals in the world. And maybe people have that. And if they don't have a philosophy, maybe that's the problem. If they don't have a philosophy, they have to obey somebody instead, right? So I'd rather have somebody who's pretentious if they can come up with something that points to very troubling aspects in philosophy or potential philosophy, then I would rather have that than somebody saying, I don't have a philosophy, so I'm going to do whatever my masters tell me, right? Okay, see you in the next one.